Good morning, friends. We are continuing with the Ananda way of life, guidelines for conduct of members of the Sevaka order, and we're working on the life vow. So let's say a prayer and we'll begin. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to live joyously and free, in complete confidence that you are always watching over us, guiding our every step, taking us by the only possible route from delusion to enlightenment. Bless us, guide us, be with us always. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, we are in the 6 paragraphs of the life vow of the Sevaka order. We are in the middle of the 3rd paragraph, and here's a wonderful sentence, the last sentence here. Henceforth, I relinquish all sense of I and mine in my life. I offer all that I own and all that I am at thy feet of infinity. Now, what's so fun about this part of the vow, which of course is, if it were a song, you know, it would be the part where the melody really soars and everybody declares, because it is so emphatic. But it's, I offer all that I own and all that I am at the feet of infinity. But this vow comes in the context of everything else that we've been reading. And very specifically, Swami talks about, you know, people can keep their own personal possessions, you can keep your own money, you don't have to impoverish yourself. We had lots of discussions about that being a more Dwapara Yuga way to go forward than poverty. So we're talking about simplicity, but the vow itself says, I offer all that I own, not merely all that I am, but all that I own. Own is anything outside of your inner reality. Of course, your body is something that you own in a very real sense. Your talents, all of the everything that you consider yours, and that is personality and abilities and the service that you can offer. It's not just your material things. In fact, it has to be more than just your material things, because Swami's already said that you get to keep them if you want to. But here we're making this vow to give them up. But what we're doing is we're offering them at the feet of infinity. He doesn't say, I give everything to Ananda. And when it really comes down to that part of the vow, you know, I relinquish henceforth, I love his language, henceforth, from this time onward, I relinquish all sense of I and mine. I mean, that is really something to contemplate. And this also tells us that the vow is an affirmation of what I aspire to become, rather than what I am right now. That fundamental identification with this unique individuality is the source of all our difficulties. When I was 18 and I read Swami Vivekananda's book at that time, and it was my introduction to the teachings of self-realization. And there were a few aphorisms in there that guided my life from that point onward. And one of them was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. And I'm not sure whether I remember the words exactly, but that's how I took it, and how I remembered, how I repeated it to myself, have repeated it for decades since. And I also profoundly remember how utterly puzzling that was to me. I mean, I knew it was true, and I And there was a huge philosophical, Vedantic explanation about how you could exist without having to be self-preoccupied. But I was 18, and I was always aware of myself. I don't know if I ever lost the awareness of that I was doing it. But I also was absolutely fascinated by the very idea that if you don't think about yourself, you'll be happy. That if I don't ask myself, Asha, how are you doing? Asha's doing just fine. It only becomes an issue when I turn and focus on it and ask the question. Now, this is not suppression. This is not sort of running away from your problems. This is actually reorienting our point of focus, reorienting our self-definition. Swami Kriyananda used the phrase, I never identify with Kriyananda, with Swami Kriyananda. I consider Swami Kriyananda to be an event for which I am responsible, which again has been one of those aphorisms that just is so marvelous, because that means you have to participate with full intelligence, dedication, willpower, and commitment, because you are an event for which you are responsible. You can't take this teaching to mean that you can become passive or inert or unconscientious about how you carry that out. But the idea that I am something other than what I appear to be, and what the materialistic world, even my own egoic thinking, that this is actually me. This is just an event. Now, I was a person, have been a person in my life who's helped organize lots of big events. So I understand what it is to put on a big event. I know how you have to work and how you have to think about everything, and every detail matters, and everything has to be lined up, and there's this huge, flow of energy, all of that to make it happen. But to think of my actual personal life also like that, where I don't have to always be thinking that my happiness depends on how it's going. I mean, if I'm in charge of an event, I like it to go well. If circumstances move beyond my control and it collapses, well, there it is. I don't feel like it's that I have collapsed. It's merely it that has collapsed. What about taking that one step back? Oh, look, and a friend of mine had what she used to call the photo caption way of regarding her own life. And what that would mean is you take, now literally we do take snapshots, but this was long before cell phones. But you sort of take a snapshot and you write a caption. The caption says, this is the part in which the heroine faces great obstacles and finds herself unable to continue courageously. So, this is what happens to the heroine in this part of the story. And we take that one step back, that the heroine is actually what I'm accustomed to call me. But nonetheless, this is the part where the heroine struggles, because occasionally the heroine struggles. This is the part in which the heroine fails completely and loses hope of ever being happy again. And I still do to this day. I write photo captions sometimes from my life experience, just looking at myself like that. Now, that's kind of a lighthearted way almost to think about it. But wow, to just even meditate, I relinquish all sense of I and mine. Hence, everything I own and everything that I am, I offer at the feet of infinity. So what this says is, my life no longer belongs to me. Everything that I am, I give to God. And God may want me to keep using it. When we give it to God, it doesn't mean that we're no longer engaged in the event. It just means that we're no longer in charge. My father made a joke, or I don't know if it was original with him, but he was talking, I've shared this with you before, but in the Los Angeles town, Southern California town where my parents lived, there was a retirement home for for missionaries, world missionaries. It was a wonderful place. It was called Pilgrims Place. And missionaries from all over the world, probably from one denomination, but I don't know what it was, would retire there. And then once a year they would have this fair, and all the missionaries would go out on the sidewalk and they would share beautiful things that they'd gathered from around the world, and the whole town would come in, and it was just a lovely sort of exchange, because many of these people had had really interesting experiences. And Southern California, the weather is very predictable as a rule, but on one of these pilgrim festivals, as they were called, it was very rainy. And so everybody was out, but they were sort of covered in plastic, and their tables were covered in plastic, and it was a bit messier than usual. And my father, being cheeky, said to one of the missionaries, "After all you've given to God, you would think that God could give you good weather on this one day." And of course he was just teasing. And the missionary, without missing a beat, said, "Ah, yes." He said, "Weather is a decision made by management. My whole career was in sales." And it was just perfect, you know, because all that I am and all that I own, I have put in the hands of God. And if he wants to rain on me, that's fine. You see, you get this picture where you are surrendered to the divine, because that comes up earlier, doesn't it? In openness and surrender to God's will. How do we get there? We surrender to God's will because I'm not in charge anymore. It doesn't mean I have no responsibility. That doesn't mean I have no commitment. I have to work as if everything still depended on me. But in my heart, I've just given this over. This just isn't mine anymore. And we know what that can feel like. We know what it can feel like when we've laid it at the feet. And then Divine Mother says to us, "Well, but I want you to do this, I want you to do that." I was talking to a friend of mine, Vyasa, who's had a very interesting scientific career in his life, and I've known him for many decades. And for a time when he lived in Palo Alto, he worked, I think, for the Xerox research division, or I'm not highly knowledgeable, but Vyasa told me that he always wanted to be a scientist, and he had certain desires in his life, and he commented to me how he got to do just a little bit of everything that he wanted. He has a patent or two, he has a few published papers, he did some interesting experiments, he was an astronomer, he got to work with some wonderful equipment and do some interesting work. But he didn't make his life any of those things, but he said he felt like he went through and he picked up the pieces. Just a little bit of everything that was there. For me, I've had certain karmic inclinations, and I watched how at different times I got to play it out. When I still lived at Ananda village, on 2 different occasions, I sort of played the politician. I got to speak in front of the board of supervisors, and I organized with Swamis, under Swami's tutelage, got people's signatures on petitions and presented the petitions and spoke to the newspapers, that sort of thing in Nevada County, which is pretty small, after we did this adventure, which worked out very well. Swami called it later a tempest in a teapot, is what he called it. Swami had been the king of England, so doing a little bit of political action in Nevada County, especially in the 1970s when it was really a backwater. I was with a group of about 10 of us, and we had been in Italy, and then we all flew over to England and went on a bit of a holiday. And Swami went to visit some old family friends in England, and we had this van, and this Englishman, Matthew Sloan, came with us because he felt that as Americans we would be helpless in his country without his help. So he was the chauffeur because he knew which side of the road to drive on and so on. So we had this big van that we rented so that we could all ride in it. And Matthew was the driver, and Swami sat next to him. And Swami had just written Mystic Harp, which is a wonderful album of Celtic music that Derek Bell, who was the harpist for the Chieftains, a very well-known Irish band, he recorded it. And so we had the music on the player in the car, and so we weren't talking, we were just playing this, listening to these gorgeous Celtic melodies, driving through the countryside of England. Swami was in the front seat with his driver, but Matthew's vibration was more than just a driver. You know, he was there to support the king. And what someone in the back of the car said, "We're driving through England with one of her former kings." And the landscape is still the same. We're just sort of looking at all of this, you know, and it's so, it was an extraordinary experience. Just to finish, because that was quite a day, quite a time. We went to the cathedral at Canterbury, where the Archbishop of Canterbury had lived. And when Yogananda was William the Conqueror, Lanfranc, who was the monk who became the Archbishop there of Canterbury, which was the head of the church there, was Sri Yukteswar. And so we went to there to go to church there on a Sunday morning, and then go out to lunch afterwards. I love this, at the local Italian restaurant in this very Protestant country. And the name of the restaurant was Il Vaticano, which means the Vatican. We went there because we heard it was good, but also because we loved the sense of humor. But so somehow or another we were a little bit late. And so we got to the Mass. The most people were already in the church. And so we were shunted over by the usher to this sort of, there were a lot of little alcoves. We were shunted over to this alcove way in the corner, and we're all sitting there. And it was we were a little out of the central part, and it was a little disappointing. I'd never been there before. I don't think any of us had been there before but Swami and Matthew. And so we're just enjoying the whole thing. Then it's time to take communion, and we all went up to take communion, and we're kneeling at the altar rail right here in this way off to the side, and we look down. Lanfranc is buried right in front of us. There's the stone, and his grave is under it. And we looked up on the wall, his handprint and his signature. And we were led right to that spot in this huge cathedral. So it was quite something. Whoever the first one of us to kneel there, you know, points it for everyone else. But it's just, in these small ways, and I'm actually going to make this very serious, you give yourself over to God. All that I own and all that I am, I offer at the feet of infinity. I relinquish all sense of I and mine. I do not have to constantly be anxious about whether it's going to work out or not, because I've given it to God. And I'm mostly talking, of course, to people who have not taken this vow, but I'm also talking to those of us who have. You know, we do this not for social reasons. We do this because from deep within our souls, this is our truth. But it doesn't do any good to take the vow if you don't remember it, if you don't constantly use it to come back and say, why am I anxious? So going all the way back to where I was, to the tempest in the teapot, because I didn't know at that time, I hadn't had these experiences with Swami. I didn't know as many things as I learned later. You know, Swami was always surprising me. I remember, and this was very early, in the 70s, I'd never traveled. I didn't have a passport until I was 34. And I never left the country except when I lived in El Paso, and I would cross over to Juarez from time to time, but that was not really foreign travel. And I knew vaguely that Swami had had all these other experiences, but this French-Canadian television crew came to film Swami, and this was 73 or something like that. And all of a sudden, Swami's in front of this camera, and he's giving the whole interview in French. And just giving it in French as easily as he could have given it in English. And I mean, many people speak more than one language. I don't, but many people do. But it was more, it made a profound impression on me, because what it said to me was, don't ever think you know who this man is. You know, you don't reduce him down to what's familiar to you. And it was a very important cautionary moment. And so when we went through that little political thing in Nevada County, and I was very impressed by how it all worked out. That was the Bicentennial Liberty Committee. You can read about it in both The Light Bearer and my other book about Swami. But I said, "Sir, did you know how this was all going to work out?" He said, "Not in detail," he said, "but I'm not surprised." And I also learned at that point that Swami just was so surrendered to God, and so surrendered for so long. And he was so comfortable with that what he had complete trust in what came through him. And I, and more people that I know, we have trust, but we also want to know what it's going to mean and how it's going to work out. Whereas Swamiji, and I learned over the years much more, much more than I could even imagine, he just trusted. He trusted his own surrender. He wasn't always having to take it back and see if it was still working. So whatever intuitive impulses came to him, he just had the confidence to flow with them. And he didn't second guess himself, and he didn't need to know. So as we did that little political action, which for me was a much bigger deal than it was for him, he just made each decision as we went along, and then the whole thing unfolded in this perfect way. The detail that I'll share was simply that we did this without identifying ourselves as Ananda. And then there was this, it was sort of orchestrated when we brought Ananda back into it. It was sort of like we created this huge controversy, and then Ananda became the voice of reason in the middle of it. It all worked really well. And I said to Swami, "Did you know?" "No," he said, "not in detail." And then he used this wonderful phrase, "But I'm not surprised." And that was when he just talked about intuition. He just made every decision according to intuition in the moment, and he was not at all surprised it worked out. Because when we live in openness and surrender to God, then Divine Mother does what she wants to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it comes out positively. This one came out positively. When we were caught up in those years of litigation, half of that came out really well, and half of that came out really awful. And in fact, during the time that everything was going wrong and nothing we did ever worked, Swami said, "The law of averages says that at least some things will go in your favor." And he said, so when everything goes wrong, you know it's Divine Mother. Wow, isn't that an interesting way to look at it? Because Swami was completely surrendered, and he didn't second guess himself. See, all of the spiritual path, we think it's about trusting God, but God is totally trustworthy. I mean, like he doesn't need to be tested and proved. Divine Mother loves us unconditionally. We have a hard time believing it, but it's a fact. The Masters love everyone equally. We are all equally children of God. What we have to learn to trust is ourselves. We have to learn to believe our own experience, and then have the courage to put our lives on the line with that. I was very, very fortunate, but I've also had to think about this. I had a lot of courage and confidence in throwing my hat in the ring and just going whatever was needed with Ananda without any concern, because Swami was always he was the last voice of responsibility. If I was just doing what he asked me to do, it was fine. I never worried about anything. When I moved away from him physically, and I was working the project without him right there making the final decision, that was a different reality. But then I had to ask myself, what's the difference? Physical proximity was very convenient, but what was the difference? I could still feel his consciousness, I could still receive his inspiration, but I had to learn to trust myself. And this comes back a little bit to the sincerity that I was talking about yesterday. That if I give myself with complete sincerity, even if I'm inept. You know, it's like God won't punish me for just being 4 years old, which is what it really amounts to, if I'm doing my 4-year-old best. And I just have to trust then that this is who I am and this is the best I know, and I'm trying as hard as I can. I hope you understand this, because we lose so much energy by thinking we're not worthy and we're not good enough. And we just go in circles because we think we're not worthy and we're not good enough. And then I don't know what we think, but it's not good. But we just have to throw ourselves in there and just trust that, well, my mantra became, and it still is, but I had to use it a lot more. I am a sincere devotee. This is what has happened to me. This must be what happens to sincere devotees, including making really stupid decisions and having to live with the consequences. But that doesn't mean I'm a bad devotee. It just means that I'm sincere and this is what happens. And that's what enables us to keep a vow like this. I relinquish all sense of I and mine. I offer all that I own and all that I am at the feet of infinity. And then I don't have to worry. I mean, they have that phrase now, FOMA, fear of missing out. That's what it is, which I loved when I heard that. What I was going all the way back to the politics there, I just like everything that I have felt that I wanted in my life, or that I had to give. It's been very interesting. I've watched Divine Mother just ask it of me. You know, I had some past karma with politics, so I got to be political. I got to wear a little suit jacket and go to the Board of Supervisors meetings, and I even had a little briefcase for a period of time. And then we had all those years of litigation and all this, you know, past karma as a lawyer, which is also really in me. You know, I got to read legal papers and make suggestions to the lawyers, and I had a pair of shoes then that clicked when I walked, you know, just like I got the costume, I got the whole thing. And I didn't even know those things were important to me. But if we let Divine Mother make the decisions and just, as Swami does, day by day, just do the best that we can, and it will unfold for us. And when you take a life vow in a monastic order, which is what this is about, it's a big deal. It's a big deal in terms of the potential it has to completely change our perspective on life. And just, I'm doing my best, and the rest of it's in God's hand. Whether we're in sales or in maintenance or whatever department we're in, we're not in management anymore. Someone else is running the story. In the purification ceremony which Swami created, we say, you know, I seek purification by the grace of God. Then the light bearer speaks for the Master. Open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. So here we are. I open my heart to you. I promise to live in openness and surrender to your will. And so therefore I put everything now in your hands. God bless you.